Okay, so what if you had two dads growing up and they had completely opposite ideas about money? That's the whole idea behind Rich Dad, Poor Dad. You've got one dad, super educated but always struggling financially. And then you have the other, who dropped out in 8th grade but ended up a millionaire. So let's jump right into the very first and maybe the most important lesson from this incredible book.
Right out of the gate, you can see this massive clash in thinking. Robert Kiyosaki's actual father, his poor dad, truly believed that money was corrupting. But his rich dad, who was his best friend's father, had a totally different take. He thought the real problem, the real evil, was the struggle and the stress that comes from not having enough money. And believe me, this one difference shaped absolutely everything they did.
And this is just huge. Think about it. When you say, "I can't afford it," what happens? Your brain just shuts down. End of story. But when you ask, "How can I afford it?" well, that's a question. It's a challenge. It kicks your brain into gear and forces you to start problem solving and looking for solutions. One mindset just accepts things as they are. The other is all about finding a way.
So here's the story. When Robert was just 9 years old, he got tired of being the poor kid. So he went to his rich dad and asked him straight up, "Will you teach me how to get rich?" Rich Dad said yes, but his teaching method was, let's just say, it was pretty unique. He started by offering Robert his very first job. So what was the job? Dusting canned goods in one of Rich Dad's grocery stores. And the pay? A measly 10 cents an hour. He had to work for 3 hours every single Saturday. Now, even for 1956, that was basically nothing. But this ridiculously low wage was actually the start of a lesson that would change his life.
Yeah, the excitement of having a job wore off really fast. After a month of boring work, missing out on baseball games with his friends, and earning just enough to buy a couple of comic books, he hit a breaking point. Robert felt totally used and angry. He was ready to march in there and either demand a raise or just quit on the spot.
But here's the twist. When he finally confronted Rich Dad, the truth came out. The frustration, the anger, all of it, that was the lesson. Rich Dad wanted him to feel what it was like to be trapped working for a tiny paycheck. He let life push him around a little so that he'd finally be ready to listen and learn a different way.
And this brings us to the most famous concept from the book, the thing Rich Dad desperately wanted him to understand: how to escape what he called the rat race. You know, the endless cycle that traps almost everyone. So what is the rat race? It's that pattern. You get up, you go to work, you pay your bills, and then you do it all over again. It's a life that isn't really driven by your dreams or your goals, but by two really powerful emotions: fear and desire. Here's how it plays out for most people. First, the fear of not being able to pay your bills. That gets you out of bed every morning and off to a job you probably don't even love. Then, the paycheck lands in your account and boom, desire kicks in. You start thinking about all the cool stuff you can buy. And then the pattern just repeats over and over again, trapping you in a loop. So here's the crucial takeaway. For most people, their financial life isn't run by logic or by their brain. It's run by these two raw emotions. Fear is what keeps you chained to the job, and desire is what keeps you spending everything you make, which of course means you have to keep going back to that job.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head. It explains why getting a raise usually doesn't solve anything. More money just leads to a bigger house, a nicer car, which means bigger bills, and, you guessed it, even more fear. You're not actually breaking the cycle, you're just making the hamster wheel spin a little bit faster.
So to teach the boys how to actually break this cycle, Rich Dad did something that sounds completely insane. After Robert complained about the lousy pay, Rich Dad cut his pay to 0. He told them to keep showing up and keep working for free. The whole point was to force their minds to see opportunities to make money that went way beyond just collecting a paycheck.
And you know what? This crazy, radical lesson actually worked. By taking the paycheck completely out of the equation, he forced them to stop thinking like employees and start thinking like business owners.
This was the big question they now had to figure out. All of a sudden, their focus wasn't on how much will I get paid for my time, but on how can we create value here? Their brains were finally switched on, just like Rich Dad wanted.
And as they were working for free in that little store, they started to notice something. The comic book distributor would throw out the old, unsold comics, but before he tossed them, he'd rip off the front covers. Now, to everyone else, this was just trash, but to them, it was a golden opportunity.
What they came up with was just brilliant. They got all their inventory, all the comic books, for free. They set up a little library in Mike's basement, and then they charged the neighborhood kids an admission fee, the very same 10 cents they used to slave away for, to come in and read as many comics as they wanted. They even hired Mike's sister as staff.
So what was the result? They were pulling in an average of $9.50 a week. For a couple of kids back then, that was a ton of money. And here's the most important part. They were making this money whether they were physically in the basement or not.
And that was it. That was the light bulb moment. They had learned Rich Dad's first, most powerful lesson. They had stopped working for money. Instead, they had built a little business, an asset, that was now making money work for them.
Okay, so what can we all learn from this story? Let's boil it down to the key lessons that you can start thinking about today.
So, in a nutshell, here's the fundamental difference. The poor and the middle class work for their money. The rich have their money work for them. The trick is to stop letting fear and desire run the show. You have to start using your mind to spot opportunities instead of just chasing a bigger paycheck. Your financial education is truly the most powerful tool you have to finally get off that hamster wheel.
And that really brings us to the big question this whole lesson leaves us with. It's a tough one, but you've got to ask yourself, right now, is your job your only source of income? Are you working for money, or are you building something that will one day make money work for you? Because honestly, the answer to that question could change everything.